Welcome to What Lies Beyond, conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. Today's guest is Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo is the Executive Director of the Essentia Foundation and a promoter of a philosophy called metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He has a PhD in philosophy and another in computer engineering. As a scientist, he worked for the European Organisation for Nuclear Research at CERN and the Philips Research Laboratories. He's also been active in the high-tech industry for almost 30 years. His ideas have featured on Scientific American, the magazine of the Institute of Art of Ideas, The Big Think, and many other places. We had a wide-ranging conversation that began with his experiences as a computer engineer working on physics problems. We explored his idealist philosophy and its implications for artificial intelligence, understanding consciousness, and psychedelic experience. As we spoke, it became clear that idealism is a worldview that has world-shaking implications.
Bernardo, thanks for coming along. Could you start by telling me why you decided to become a scientist?
Oh, have I even decided that? Since I was a kid, I always wanted to find things out and then apply that to building cool stuff. So since as far back as I can remember, I wanted to find things out. I wanted to understand things and use that knowledge to build interesting stuff. So I never really, the question was not even present for me. It was like something I always took for granted that I would go on and study science and engineering. And sure enough, I had just turned 17 and I find myself in computer engineering school. And as soon as I finished that, I wasn't even 22 yet. I was just about to turn 22 and started working at CERN in Switzerland. Hardcore science. So these things have always been with me, finding things out in science and philosophy and then applying that in engineering.
Yeah. So CERN's the enormous particle accelerator, isn't it? Where
correct.
Associated with the Higgs boson is the main claim to fame, I think.
So unfortunately, yeah, and they have done a lot more cool stuff than just confirming the existence of something we sort of knew existed. But the Higgs boson was officially found and announced at CERN in 2012. But I was already gone for several years. I was there between 96 and 98.
Okay.
96 and 97. And then 98, I moved to corporate research.
So just before, but what you're saying is you have an in-depth background in computers, so that's not just the software, it's understanding the hardware as well.
First and foremost, it's the hardware. When I was at CERN, I was a scientist. That was my official title, but I worked in the data acquisition system of the LHC experiment, of the Atlas experiment of the Large Hadron Collider, the LHC, particularly the colorimeter. So we basically created custom, computers to process the data generated by the experiment very fast, because the experiment would generate and does generate many terabytes of information per second. So you have to analyze all that online. You cannot store it for further analysis later because it's just a tsunami of data. So we had to build computers that understood the physics well enough to make a decision about, can this be the Higgs boson? If yes, we store it. If not, we throw it away. And we had to throw away about 98% of everything, all the data generated. But of course, you don't want to throw away the Nobel Prize, the Higgs boson. So those computers needed to be sort of autonomous physicists, let's put it that way. So that's what I was involved with, because it merged my passion for physics and my passion for engineering.
So from the start, you were really doing multidisciplinary work. So you weren't just specializing in one sort of narrow discipline. It was actually wider than that. Do you think that sort of affected how your sort of thinking about the world developed as you went along?
Today, I'm sure it did. Yeah. Of course, until my 40s, you know, we are who we are, and we are our only reference. So we tend not to be very aware of the peculiarities that each one of us embodies. We think everybody else is like us. At least I tended to think like this most of my life. So I was not aware that I have always had a tendency to sort of go across the artificial boundaries between disciplines, because I never recognized those boundaries as real. They are merely for convenience. It allows us to give different names to different aspects of nature and choose what we study with more depth. But to me, those boundaries were never really real or solid. So I always went across. And to this day, I keep on doing that. Philosophy, engineering, science, neuroscience, physics. So I have always had this, if you are a positive person, you would say this ability to go across boundaries. If you're a negative person, you would say this lack of discipline to not focus on the one thing that you need to pay attention to, and instead sort of dispersing my attention. So whichever way you like to look at it, they're both probably right.
Because there's still a lot of pressure in academia, isn't there, to sort of very much focus on one speciality?
Probably. I have never been employed by academia, so I never faced that. Even my 2 PhDs, in the Netherlands, doing a PhD can be a job. You get paid by the government for 5 years to develop your research. I never did that. I was always working for the private sector in parallel with doing my PhD. Again, doing multiple things at once. So I don't know that from direct experience. I am, and I don't want to say that in a negative sense, but I am an extreme individualist. I do not accept people telling me what to do and what not to do. Of course, I had bosses all my life, and they gave me directions. But in the Netherlands, being a boss is like being one of the pack that has the responsibility to lead. And most of my bosses I respected. So I was not doing what they told me to do because I had to, but because I respected their wisdom, their experience. So because I have always been such an extreme individualist, in a positive sense, I mean, I'm glad to contribute a lot of my money to society to make sure that everybody is okay, even people I don't know. But I don't like people telling me where the boundaries are. I like to explore them myself and live in my own unique, peculiar way and doing the things I'm interested in. And I have always lived like that. So I never experienced academia telling me otherwise, because I was never paid by academia. But I believe that for those who are paid by academia and have their yearly performance reviews and all the criteria they have to meet, that this could be constraining. Yeah.
So over the last decade or so, you've become very well known as a philosopher of mind who pushes an idealist view of the world, which is the view that mind, rather than physical processes, is sort of at the bottom of everything. So can you walk us through a little bit of how you arrived at that particular position?
When I was at CERN, I was in my early 20s. And as I told you, we managed to build this data acquisition system that was as smart as a physicist, just a lot faster than a physicist, to analyze data and figure out what might be new physics and what is old physics and doesn't need to be recorded. Once you do that, the next question you ask in your own mind is, well, I made an intelligent computer. Actually, we made a version with artificial neural networks as well. It was not used, but we did it illicitly, and it was just as good as the system that was used. So you build this artificial neural network that is as smart as a physicist, so it's intelligent for that application. And then you ask yourself, what does it take for me to make it conscious? And I tried to answer this question for a few years, and I realized that whatever I thought about, whatever I would change in the architecture, it would only change structure and function, and it would give me no less and no more reason to think that it's conscious. the engineering of the thing seemed to be completely detached from reasoning around what makes something conscious. And I realized that that was betraying a logical fallacy somewhere in my line of thinking. Because if you face a wall like this, it's incoherent. So you've taken a wrong turn somewhere. So I retraced my steps back to the last reliable point, the last point where I was not making an arbitrary assumption without evidence or a rationale. And I realized that the arbitrary assumption I was making is that material arrangements generate consciousness. If that's what you assume, you end up with a contradiction. I mean, David Chalmers popularized that in the famous paper on the hard problem of consciousness, which I eventually read in the early 2000s, I think. And it was sort of confirmed for me. It was a revelation, like, yeah, that's the problem. That's the wrong assumption. The wrong assumption is material arrangements generate consciousness. That, if you assume that, everything becomes incoherent, because now you change structure and function, and you're expecting to change the qualities of experience, which are incommensurable with structure and function. So I abandoned that assumption. And of course, the moment you abandon that assumption, you abandon materialism, which I always had taken sort of for granted without thinking too much about it, because everybody around me was a materialist. I was at the cathedral of materialism in CERN, where we studied matter. And if you abandon materialism, okay, then how are you going to live your life? You need a theory, a hypothesis in terms of which to go about your life, in terms of which to understand your own consciousness, your own self, and then your body and the world and other people. So for a few years, I struggled very hard, not to write a book, but to come up with a sensible, coherent alternative for myself, an alternative to materialism. And I eventually came to an objective form of idealism. And then I started writing books, first only for myself as a record, and then one got published, and then another 12 now are written.
So this sort of shift in your sort of fundamental assumptions about how the world works was very important. And it sounds to me like actually thinking about artificial intelligence was right at the base of that. Obviously, we're in an era where there are all sorts of very strong claims being made for artificial intelligence, like the claim that artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is just around the corner. And I understand you've got some fairly strong opinions about those discussions.
Very, because I see the developments in AI, which I think are a great opportunity for humankind. These are tools that vastly increase our productivity, and instead of leading to unemployment, what they should lead to is more recreation and philosophical time for everybody. So people have to work less hard. Unfortunately, there is corporate greed. So what people want to make of it is a tool to make more money and fire more people. So the profits get higher. But AI is both a great threat and a great opportunity for philosophy of mind. It is an opportunity because it brings philosophy of mind out of an academic niche and into the mainstream. Everybody now is interested in what mind is. And are these things minded? Are these things conscious, these AIs?
Yes.
When I talk to ChatGPT, does it experience what it's saying? That discussion is now mainstream and no longer a niche thing in the corner of a bookstore. That's a great opportunity, an opportunity for us philosophers of mind to vastly enlarge the scope and reach of what we are trying to do. It is also a threat in a very pernicious way, because it compounds lack of understanding to pretend to lead to understanding. It's like if you pile misunderstanding on top of misunderstanding, eventually on the top of that pile, you think you got clarity. Of course you don't. You just get crap. You swim in crap. You swim in the sewer of intellectual production. But that sewer can be mistaken for revelation and clarity. Why am I saying this? Because we already have this mainstream metaphysics called materialism, which is internally inconsistent, empirically incoherent. It doesn't line up with empirical results. It's not even logical. Has very little explanatory power, but it is mainstream. We think that everything there is matter, and we are also made of matter, and the matter in our brains somehow generates our consciousness. That's what a lot of people think. Now, this is the worst metaphysical option on the table. It's flat out bull, and demonstrably so. But it's popular because of social political dynamics that have their origin back in the 17th century and became exacerbated when the bourgeoisie, accumulated control over the intellectual elites in the second half of the 19th century. So there is an explanation for this, and it has nothing to do with materialism being a good option, but it is mainstream. Materialism is a misunderstanding. It's part of the sewer of intellectual production. But when you have a material thing like a large language model or a transformer of any kind, an AI, and it seems to talk like a human being and produce answers like a human being, the naive person on the streets would think, well, materialism is right, because here is something that engineers just hacked together, and look, it's like a person, it's conscious too, so obviously consciousness is generated from material arrangement. Now, that's misunderstanding piled on top of misunderstanding. The first misunderstanding is that materialism holds any water. It doesn't. Even modern materialists acknowledge that mainstream materialism is kaput. It goes nowhere. And the other misunderstanding is to think that a silicon AI, silicon computer, that we have any reason to think of it as conscious. It's a complete lack of understanding of what's happening. An AI does not reason. Engineers call one of the modules in an AI architecture the reasoning module. But this is wishful thinking. The reasoning module has nothing to do with what we call reasoning in colloquial language. They also have another module. I'm also an AI engineer, by the way. I'm building AI hardware right now. Another module is the attention module. It has nothing to do with attention. The relationship with the colloquial meaning of the word attention is marginal. It's even forced. If you understood what an AI actually does, it's a series of geometrical transformations applied on tokenized data. Let me unpack this. When you have text is written with letters, an alphabet, and words that we understand because we attribute meaning to them. It's a convention. We come together and we establish the convention that TREE means a tree with a trunk and leaves and root systems. We could have called it blah, blah, and it would be equally valid because it's a convention. Now, an AI only sees blah, blah because it's trained on text and not on what the text is referring to in terms of the reasoning behind it, the logical steps. And it takes these words and tokenizes them, transforms these words into values, numbers, that populate a space, an abstract, hyperdimensional space. And then it applies transformations, geometrical transformations on these numerical tokens. And then at the end, translates it back to words. In other words, it's purely mechanistic. There is no reasoning going on. There is no logic thinking. The AI has no understanding of what it's spitting out. What it spits out is coherent because it was trained on text written by humans, which is then coherent because it reflects human intelligence. The AI only sort of rearranges human output back to you in a way that looks like it produced its own output. No, it just applied geometrical transformations to previous human output. If there were no humans in this mixture, the AI would be spitting out incoherent numbers because it doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't have understanding, let alone consciousness. So if you understand this, then AI will contribute to the defeat of materialism. But we got to a point now where you almost need a PhD in philosophy and another one in computer engineering to actually understand what's going on. Most people would just do a ChatGPT query and they would think, oh, look, it talks like a person. So if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? It's conscious like a person. Leading to the cultural a conclusion that, oh no, we got it right, materialism is right? No, you're swimming in the sewer of intellectual production, and you would think that you were at the leading edge of human understanding, and that's the great threat.
So that's interesting. I did a master's in cognitive science back in the 90s, and first of all, we had to actually program it as a very simple chatbot. But secondly, we did the thought experiment with a philosopher called John Searle, called the Chinese Room. And without going into details, it was a thought experiment that showed that you could have the appearance of intelligent responses without any understanding at all. And when I played around with ChatGPT, I always think of the Chinese Room.
You're completely right. I mean, we can summarize the thought experiment very quickly. Imagine that there is a hermetically sealed room, and there are only two little windows, two slots, like a letter slot in your door, where somebody can slide a piece of paper in, and the room can slide a piece of paper out on the other slot, or maybe even the same slot. So imagine that you're a Chinese person. You're on the outside of the room. So you write a question in Chinese symbols on a piece of paper, and you shove it into the room. And then after a little while, a piece of paper comes out of the slot with a perfectly good Chinese answer to the question you asked in Chinese. So the Chinese speaker on the outside thinks the room is intelligent. But what's actually going on is that there is an English-speaking clerk inside the room who does not know Chinese at all. But he has an enormous book of rules telling him, if you get these symbols in a sequence, you write these other symbols in a sequence. And the book has as many rules as the different sequences of Chinese characters that you can get in. So the clerk just follows the rules, writes down the squiggles, because for the clerk who doesn't speak Chinese, Chinese symbols are just squiggled. Let's call them tokens. Writes down the tokens, having no idea what has been written in the paper coming in or what is written in the paper going out. He's just following blind rules. He slides out the piece of paper, and the Chinese on the outside sees a perfectly reasonable answer to the question and thinks the room is intelligent. The room is not. What is intelligent? Well, what is intelligent here is, one, the Chinese speaker on the outside. It is the Chinese speaker who knows what the symbols mean that go in and the symbols that come out. That's intelligent. And the Chinese speaker who wrote the manual that the clerk uses in the inside. That Chinese speaker is also intelligent. So all the intelligence is in the Chinese speakers, and it's not in the room at all. That's exactly what a transformer, an LLM, is. The Chinese speaker who wrote the rule book, well, that's all the text on the internet that companies use to train the AI. That's the rule book. That's the manual. The manual is built from text found on the web, which was written by human beings, reasoning, conscious human beings. That's your book. And the LLM just takes the tokens in, looks at the rule book, which is basically geometrical transformations, and spit out a list of tokens, which it's us who attribute meaning to when you read the output of ChatGPT. So there is no reasoning, let alone consciousness going on here.
So, I mean, the operative word there is consciousness, isn't it? And it's that missing part of the equation.
I argued this in my very first book, Rationalist Spirituality. I argued that because, when Searle published his thought experiment in 1980, there were many replies. And some of the replies are interesting. People were saying, well, the problem is that the clerk inside doesn't know how to link different squiggles or Chinese characters to elements of the world. It doesn't know that this squiggle means a mountain and that squiggle means a storm. But if those links were there, then the room would be intelligent. And you could even go and say, perhaps there are new versions of ChatGPT and Llama now that can recognize images. So now you're linking tokens to images, and you get closer and closer to being able to say that it's intelligent. But it's not conscious. At least we have absolutely no reason to think of it as conscious, because all that's going on there is mechanical switches of transistors being on and off. That's all that's going on. It's like switches on your wall, turning on and off your light, except that there are billions of them operating in an orchestrated way. But we have no reason to think of it as conscious. So I think what Searle's experiment actually appealed to when he said the computer will never be conscious, will never be intelligent, what he was appealing to was consciousness. Because the intuition behind his experiment is that the room, never understands anything. Well, what he should have said is the Chinese room never consciously understands anything, because understanding is a phenomenon of consciousness. It's hard to think of pure, clever data processing as understanding anything, right? So what the intuition behind the experiment is that the room will never be conscious, because that understanding Searle appeals to is an element of consciousness. And there I agree.
I mean, moving on to focus on idealism itself, why did you decide that was the most plausible alternative to materialism? So we've rejected materialism, and then we're moving to a view that says that everything is mind, or consciousness underlies everything. Did that arrive all at once, or was it a gradual realization that you felt that was the most plausible alternative?
Probably in between the two options. Not quite all at once, but not too gradually either, because if you start from scratch, I mean, once you realize that your entire worldview is untenable, not only implausible, but untenable, you really need to start from scratch. Now, it makes me think of Descartes when he wrote Discourse on the Method. He started from scratch as well, and then made mistakes very quickly, but it was an honorable attempt. So I sort of tried to start from scratch again. And the first thing we have to admit is that conscious states, experiential states, are the only given, are nature's only given. They are the only thing we know absolutely for sure to exist, because everything else is theorizing that happens within our minds, within the field of our experience. Everything we know in experience. Whatever you never experienced, directly or indirectly, might as well not exist for you. So experiential states are nature's given. Materialism invents a completely different kind of state, a material state, which has no experiential qualities. It's defined purely in terms of quantities, like X kilograms, Y centimeters, T duration in seconds. So this is pure abstraction. We never have direct access to these purely quantitative states. They are abstractions of our qualitative theoretical imagination. And the reason we invented them was the prejudice that experiential states are always in here, in our minds, and not out there. So if there are no experiential states out there, and there is obviously a world out there that is not in my mind, which is, of course, it's also a given of nature, then that world can only be made of states that aren't experiential. So there must be these material states to account for the external world. The fallacy here is obvious. To acknowledge that there is a world outside my mind and your mind and everybody's minds doesn't mean that that world is itself not mental. Look, your thoughts are experiential. They are mental states, and yet they are outside my mind. And we all acknowledge that other people have their mental states, which are outside us. So we just have to understand that you extrapolate this a little further, and you understand that all nature out there is made of mental states. Not mine, not yours, not anybody else's, but mental states at large that appear to us as what we call the material world, just as our own mental states appear to others and to the mirror as our material body, our material brain activity, our material nervous activity. So matter is what mental states look like when observed from the outside. That was the seminal conclusion, the seminal understanding that motivated me to idealism. All there is nature's given, mental states. But there are mental states out there as well. And what we call matter, in other words, the contents of perception, the things we can see, hear, touch, smell, taste, these are just how mental states present themselves to external observation. Matter is what mentation looks like from the outside. And that's why our brain activity correlates with our inner experience. Brain activity is what our inner experience looks like when observed from the outside. And the universe at large is what the mind of nature looks like when we observe it from the outside. I mean, we are inserted in nature, but from the outside in the sense of our subjectivity not expanding into the rest of the universe. Otherwise, we would be the universe as opposed to observing the universe.
So this is very different from, say, relativism or solipsism, where you say anything goes because it's all totally subjective. There are still the laws of physics happening.
Well, clearly, I mean, even psychology and psychiatry today know that there are laws to how mentation works, and there are surprising irregularities in how mentation works in human beings. That's why psychologists and psychiatrists can study and help people based on what they learn. Otherwise, every person would be completely different, and there would be no discipline to study. There are laws that underlie the state transitions of mental space, let's put it that way, the dynamics of mind. And idealism is certainly not solipsism, because what solipsism says is that all there is your mind. My thoughts do not really exist. All that exists is the image of me on your computer screen right now. There is nothing it is like to be me. And for a solipsist, all there is to me is my appearance in the mind of the solipsist. So if I disappear from the mind of the solipsist, because the solipsist is no longer thinking about me or imagining me, then I disappear too. Now, that's not idealism. Idealism acknowledges that there is a world out there that does not depend on our wishes, our fantasies, our morning affirmations, our beliefs, our desires or fears. No, it is out there, and it does its own thing. But it, too, just like us, is constituted of mental states that are not directly accessible to us. We can only perceive those mental states indirectly through a cognitive perceptual representation. In other words, matter. Matter is what external mental states look like when we observe them. But there is still a world, there is still a universe that unfolds according to regularities we call the laws of physics.
So in a number of your works, you've actually discussed a number of theory and experiments in quantum theory that seems to undermine the idea that there's a real world out there. And could you say a little bit about why those developments seem to undermine realism?
The canonical experiment, which has been repeated for 5 decades now and got a Nobel Prize in 2022, is the following. 2 particles, say 2 photons, are created together. They are prepared together. That's the technical word for it, emitted from a single source. And one is shot at the speed of light to one direction, and the other one is shot at the speed of light, or near the speed of light, in the opposite direction. So they go to opposite directions through, say, a fiber optic cable. And after they covered several kilometers in flight, there is a scientist called Alice on the one side that will measure particle A, and another scientist, let's call him Bob, on the other side, which will measure particle B. It turns out that what Alice chooses to measure about particle A, say the direction of angular momentum, but it doesn't matter. What Alice chooses to measure about particle A determines what Bob sees when Bob looks at particle B. Even if this choice is made only after the particles are already in flight, even after the particles were generated and they are already in flight in the optic fiber cable, only then Alice chooses what to measure, and it will still determine what Bob sees on the other side of the universe when Bob measures particle B. Now, this contradicts a notion called non-contextuality or physical realism in physics, which means that physical entities are supposed to have whatever properties they have independent of measurement. Measurement is supposed to merely unveil the properties the particles already had immediately prior to measurement. Now, this experiment contradicts physical realism because clearly what Bob measures depends on a choice made by Alice on the other side of the universe. How could Alice's choice on the other side of the universe influence Bob's measurement if what Bob is measuring is what particle B already was all along, immediately prior to measurement? Even if the choice was made after particles A and B were already in flight, it doesn't add up. So the only way to escape from this conclusion is to entertain one of two complete theoretical fantasies that have precisely zero empirical evidence. They're just fantasies. I'm not going to get into that. What this tells us is that physicality, physical properties, physical entities are the outcome of measurement. Physicality is a representation upon measurement of the thing that is measured. But the thing that is measured is not physical. It does not have physical properties, because physical properties are the representation of a measurement result. Whatever you measured, whatever it is there. It's obviously there because you made a bloody measurement. So there is something your measurement apparatus interacted with to produce this representation called a physical property. So it exists, but it's not physical because physical properties are the representations of measurement results. Why does this line dovetail with idealism? Because for an idealist, there is really a world out there, a world that we measure, but it's made of mental states, experiential states. And experiential states are qualitative, not quantitative. What is the length in centimeters of your thought? What is the temperature in degrees Celsius of your fantasy? What is the weight in kilograms of your theoretical abstraction? No, experiential states, mental states, cannot be described through physical quantities because they are qualitative, not quantitative. So for idealists, analytic idealists at least, there is a real world out there, and it's made of qualitative mental states. A physical measurement is an interaction between or across mental states. And when one mental state represents a measurement result, that representation is what we describe with physical parameters. In other words, it's a content of perception. Even if it is a measurement made through the intermediation of instrumentation, like a telescope or a microscope, you still have to perceive the output of that instrument. And that perception is a cognitive representation of our mental states, trying to represent other mental states out there. Think of it as the dashboard of an airplane. The plane has sensors that measure the states of the sky. And the results of those measurements are represented to the pilots in terms of dashboard indications in the dials of the dashboard. The dashboard represents the sky that was measured, represented it accurately. It conveys important and valid information about the states of the sky. But the dashboard isn't the sky. It's a representation thereof. And if your airplane is not making measurements, then the dashboard shows nothing. The physical world is a dashboard representation of the real world. If we don't measure, there is no physical world, because there is nothing for the dashboard to represent. It doesn't mean that there isn't a real world. There is. It's just not physical, because physicality is a dashboard representation. And this provides a very promising avenue to make sense of all these weird results in quantum mechanics. And it does so without the very wishful fantasy that it is our little consciousness that causes the collapse of the universe into a defined state. That's an appeal to magic. Unfortunately, it's still popular in physics. People thinking that, well, it's consciousness that causes collapse. It's consciousness that defines the world. But, well, that would make us beyond Superman. We would be super gods, right? We have the power to transform the state of the entire universe at a glance. No, I think that is absurd. What our consciousness does is create the representation. In other words, it creates the physical world. It doesn't change the real world at all. It creates the physical world. The problem is that we take the physical world for the real world. We take the dashboard for the sky. So if our little consciousness determines the dashboard, we think it has determined the sky, which is absurd. You see, it determines the dashboard because the dashboard is our thing. It is our internal cognitive representation. It exists in us and in us alone. So yes, our consciousness determines it because it creates it, but it doesn't determine the real world, which is non-physical.
You know, one of the focuses of this podcast is parapsychology, and there are a number of experiments called micro PK experiments that seem to show that people can affect very slightly the output of a random number generator. So what do you think of those results, and how do you relate it to what you just said?
Well, let me start first with a quick disclaimer. Probably because of my history, landing at CERN, I was not even 22 yet. I consider the ordinary incredibly mysterious. If I could only describe to you in short enough words that would fit in this podcast, how mysterious what happens inside a proton is, how incredibly mysterious it is, how 3 quarks and force-carrying particles being exchanged between the 3 quarks create inertial mass. Now, the inertial mass of a proton is not mostly the inertial mass of the 3 quarks. It arises from the dynamics, the interactions between the 3 quarks, and all the conservation of momentum rules related to how force-carrying particles are exchanged. It's incredibly complicated and mysterious what happens inside a proton. And since very early on, I have been aware of that. So for me, the ordinary is incredibly mysterious, so I have no patience for the extraordinary, if you know what I mean. The paranormal doesn't attract me much because I'm already overwhelmed enough with the mystery of sitting in my office talking to you or tasting the saltiness of salt, which is made of 2 atoms, one which is inert, the other one which can kill you in gas form, chlorine. So I find that massively mysterious. Life is massively mysterious. So I have little patience for the paranormal. This is a bit of a prejudice for me, not that I'm passing any kind of objective judgment in the field. I don't. I think I know many good people who are working in this field. Now, regarding your question in particular, under analytic idealism, life is a dissociative mechanism in a field of subjectivity, a field of mind. That's why I can't read your thoughts, and you presumably can't read mine right now. You are a dissociated process. I am another dissociated process. Therefore, we are dissociated from one another and from the rest of the world. This is why we perceive the world instead of being the world. We are separated from it by a psychological mechanism that is well known in psychiatry called dissociation, which exists. We can objectively diagnose it since the advent of neuroimaging 20-odd years ago. So my hypothesis is that we can't read each other's thoughts, or we can't influence the world directly without using our hands or our bodies. The reason we can't do that, we can't change the world by a thought, is because we are dissociated from the mental states that constitute the world. And therefore, our internal dissociated mental dynamics does not have a direct causal link to the mental states of the world. So to influence them, we have to use our body, which are also the representations of certain mental states, but a particular mechanism of influence, and not what we call mind over matter. That's why psi phenomena are not rampant, because without dissociation, everything would be one mind. So psi would be everywhere. It would be the modus operandi of the universe. But it's not, and it's not because of dissociation. Now, no process in nature is perfect. In other words, when it stops raining, the water on the ground doesn't evaporate immediately or completely. When something burns, the combustion doesn't burn everything there is to burn in it. No process in nature is perfectly is perfect. Why would dissociation? So dissociation too, although it is precisely the thing that we have evolved to maintain, because dissociation is life. Life is what dissociation looks like. And of course, evolution by natural selection tries to preserve life. Therefore, it seeks to preserve and optimize the dissociation because it's the same thing. Life is what dissociation looks like. But even after and now people are contemplating maybe even 4.2 billion years of life on Earth, there is very little reason to think that dissociation would be perfect. Respiration is not perfect. ATP burning is not perfect. DNA transcription is not perfect. Why would be dissociation? So it stands to reason that now and then, under specific conditions, there could be traffic of states across dissociative boundaries. In other words, what you call psi. And people could maybe influence subtle, delicate processes in the world up there directly through a mental influence that sort of percolates through and across the dissociative boundary, because the dissociative boundary, of course, is not perfect. It would be a miracle if it were perfect.
That's a very interesting response. I think I'm with you with the wonder of the world. I think one of the things that I know materialism does, particularly not so much in the specialists, but particularly in the mainstream, is it's almost makes the world too mundane and detracts from what we actually observe. But sorry, one thing, but you've also written about altered states of consciousness and a little bit about near-death experiences, the implication for things like psychedelic studies. So could you tell me a little bit about how that fits into your ideas about idealism and the implications of that?
Yeah, I'm not a student of near-death experiences at all. And the paper you're referring to was an invited paper from the Journal of Near-Death Studies, because they had received a paper by other authors who were very critical of the use of quantum theory in the psi community, and they asked me to defend them. I think partly the original paper had a point, but as it usually happens in so-called skeptical circles, they start with a good point, but then they go way beyond what is justified by logic and reason with that point. And those authors had done that. They had gone too far. And so I was invited to write a defense, which I did. But I'm not a student of NDEs. Okay. I think, look, under ordinary conditions, we are a dissociative process in the mind of nature. And that's why we have a private inner life. That's why you can't think my thoughts directly, because of this dissociation that we call life, biology. Biology is what this dissociation looks like. When you take a relatively strong dose of a psychedelic, such as psilocybin or dimethyltryptamine, or what was the third one that they studied? It escapes me now, but several psychedelics have been studied.
I think it's LSD.
LSD. When you do that and they measure your brain activity and compare that to your default brain activity, under normal conditions without the drug, the most striking observation is that brain activity is reduced. There are many other effects, like there is increased functional coupling across different brain regions. There is a very, very mild and almost non-measurable increase in entropy. In other words, desynchronized brain activity. But that's all regarding the brain activity that is left. The most repeated and clear effect is brain activity reduces. And yet, consciousness expands. I mean, it's cliche to describe a psychedelic trance as consciousness expanding. It's not only cliche, it's a vast understatement. I have taken psychedelics myself as part of my research years ago. And to call it a consciousness expansion, it's like calling a drop of water a major hurricane. Sorry, the other way around. Calling a major hurricane a drop of water. Your mind expands beyond anything that can be described. How can that happen with a reduction in brain activity, given that brain activity is what your mind looks like when measured from the outside? Shouldn't we be seeing the opposite? Everybody thought we would be seeing the opposite until 2012, when we realized, no, it's a reduction of brain activity. How do I account for that tentatively? if we are dissociative processes, then our regular brain activity is not only what the contents of our dissociation, in other words, our thoughts, our feelings, our fantasies, it's not only what the contents of our dissociation look like, but it's what the dissociative process itself looks like. The dissociative boundary itself must look like something that we call brain anatomy and brain activity. Because we are not only the dissociative contents, we are also the dissociative process. So the image of us, the metabolizing body, is also an image of the dissociative boundary, not only of the dissociative contents. My hypothesis is that what psychedelics do, and cardiac arrest as well, because if your heart's not beating, there is no blood oxygenation in your brain, and your brain activity reduces too. It cannot do anything else but reduce. So both things, cardiac arrest and psychedelics, reduce brain activity. I think what's happening is that the brain activity that reduces is that which corresponds to the dissociative boundary itself. So what the drug and cardiac arrest are doing is they are making the dissociative boundary porous, permeable, allowing you to experience stuff in your cognitive neighborhood that does not correlate with your physical body, allowing you to pick up on mental states that are beyond what you normally call you, accessing your cognitive neighborhood beyond space and time. And of course, that is mighty weird stuff because it's not human stuff. It's stuff that was there already before humans evolved to filter it out and dissociate from it and create its own cozy, understandable internal inner life. You take a drug that takes down the dissociative boundary, that keeps you separate from that primordial stuff out there that isn't human, you will experience it as profound weirdness. Of course you will. What else, right? It's not your human stuff. It's not your normal stuff. Now, of course, there are degrees of it. We have internal dissociative boundaries as well. Psychiatrists and psychologists know this. We dissociate ourselves from the skeletons in our cabinets, right? In our closets, our traumas and certain memories. The drug takes down those internal dissociative boundaries as well. So first you come in contact with the skeletons in your closet, which are still human, but at some point during the trance, if you took a high enough dose, you come in contact with non-human stuff. And everybody would describe it that way. Everybody would say, beyond this point, you're no longer human. That's a dissociative boundary that has been temporarily incredibly weakened. And now you're coming in direct contact with the world as it is in itself, as opposed to the world as your cognitive system represents in the form that we call physical. You will be coming in direct contact with what is really out there in your cognitive neighborhood. And it's mighty scary stuff.
What you're saying resonates very much with what William James, who's the great philosopher and one of the founders of psychology, said in Varieties of Religious Experience. And he was inspired in turn by a man called Frederick Myers, who they were talking about the subliminal mind, but the idea essentially is that mystical states are even drugs. I think he actually took nitrous oxide and said there are many worlds just parallel to where we are. And I think he likened it to that the self is like something, surrounded by a rickety fence, which surrounds it, which separates it from this broader reality.
Of course, that's what evolution by natural selection would do. The first living organism was a spontaneous dissociation, right? The ones that survived are the ones of those spontaneous dissociations that could reproduce, maybe only one of them. And evolution by natural selection would make us change over time so as to maintain that dissociation as effectively as possible and as efficiently as possible. Two different words, and I'm using them deliberately. So effectiveness means we should survive. Efficiently means we should survive with the least amount of energy or effort. How do you do that? Well, you create a cognitive system that represents your surroundings well enough for you to be aware of dangers and opportunities. So our visual system, our perceptual apparatus will represent the external states of the world to us in the form we call physical, in such a way that threats and opportunities with a bearing on our ability to survive will be represented. But everything else out there, which does not have a bearing on our ability to survive, would not be represented, because our representational system is efficient, not only effective. Why would it go through the trouble of burning energy to represent stuff that has no bearing on our ability to survive, or little bearing on our ability to survive? Stuff that isn't salient for survival. It wouldn't. And therefore, we wouldn't see it. We wouldn't hear it. We wouldn't touch it, while we may be completely surrounded by it at all times. Statistically, the chance that our cognitive system would pick out everything out there, relevant or not relevant, salient or not salient to survival, is infinitesimal. It's preposterous to think that it would. Of course, we don't pick out a great lot of things out there. Why would we, if it's not salient for survival? These may be all these other worlds that are unfolding out there at all times that you quoted James speaking of. I haven't read James, but based on what you said, I think it's eminently reasonable to think that there is a lot more going on than we can discern through perception.
Yeah, what you said reminds me very much of Donald Hoffman's arguments about the case against reality. So he's a cognitive scientist who uses very similar natural selection arguments, and he says that natural selection will not let us access reality. It will just let us see the world in the way that will let us survive. So that seems to me to dovetail exactly with what you're saying.
Well, it's a parallel argument. There is a subtlety here. What I'm claiming is that a lot of what's out there is not represented at all in whatever form. It's not represented at all. There is nothing in perception that correlates with a lot of what's happening out there. That is the most likely scenario by far. What Donald is saying, which I agree with, is that of those things that are represented, they are not represented as they actually are. They are represented in whatever other way facilitates our survival. In other words, evolution drives towards survival, fitness, not towards truth. Think of it as your computer desktop. I mean, I use the metaphor of the dashboard of an airplane. You know, the dashboard doesn't look like the sky. It represents the sky, but it does so in a way that is most efficient for the pilot. You don't see the sky as it is in itself on the dashboard. It's represented in a completely different way to reduce entropy and facilitate prompt responses to threats and opportunities. So Donald uses another metaphor, the desktop, which is a computer file on your desktop computer on the screen is represented as a little colorful rectangle. Is that what your computer file actually is? No, your computer file is a set of millions and millions and millions of microscopic switches that may be open or closed in a memory chip. It doesn't look at all like a colorful little rectangle on your screen. Why do we represent files that way? Well, because that's most efficient. Allows you to work with the file most efficiently, because if you were to see the file as it actually is, millions of microscopic switches open or closed, you wouldn't even know what it is. You would be overloaded with information you can act on. It would be very suboptimal. So what Don is saying is that what we call the physical world, colloquially, in other words, the contents of perception, the stuff we see and hear, those forms and shapes are not the forms and shapes of what is really out there. Just like round dials on a dashboard do not correspond in form to the clouds in the sky outside. It's a way to represent things. So according to Donald, what we see is the computer desktop representation of nature. So the virtual reality headset. It's not nature as it is in itself. Why? Because that's not what we evolved to do. We evolved to survive. We need to work with the icons on the desktop most efficiently, not see them or perceive them the way they really are, because that would drive us swiftly to extinction, and you can prove that using game theory. So these are two things. One is what we do pick out from the world. We don't represent to ourselves the way things actually are in the world. Why would we? and separate to it, there's a lot we don't pick out at all, and therefore don't represent at all.
I have to say, because I've been reading a lot of your books in the last couple of weeks, and I find them very mind blowing in sort of best possible sense. I'm a great fan of Philip K. Dick, so I think that's what I was really enjoying about them, that they're really turning a lot of the thinking about the world sort of upside down. I was reading your book, Meaning and Absurdity, which was looking at sort of high strangeness experiences, such as people experience in old states and other situations. And it gives you and essentially it's almost like you can tune in and tune out occasionally to these other realities you were talking about. And it's quite an eerie thing to think that there might be lots going on around us that we really have no. Sometimes I read The New Scientist and the impression you get is, oh, well, we know virtually everything. We've got a few I's to dot and T's to cross. But I think what I like about in your books, you start to lay out the ramifications and different dimensions of this new emerging worldview. And I think it's a very exciting thing.
Yeah. Lord Kelvin said in 1900, I believe, that physics was done and all we needed to do is to refine measurement precision. And then came Einstein 5 years later, and then came Bohr and Heisenberg and quantum mechanics, and we realized that all the physics Lord Kelvin knew was actually wrong. It worked in practice in certain regiments, but it was, strictly speaking, wrong. Newtonian mechanics is wrong. That's not how the world works. There is no invisible force of gravity acting at a distance, But every generation still thinks that we figured it out, and that has to do with our psychological need for closure. We need to attain closure before we die. But that speaks of us, not of nature, or our knowledge of nature. Look, if there is a lot more going on out there than we have evolved to pick out through perception, which of course there is. It would be incredibly unlikely if that were not the case, right? To the point of being unreasonable. What would happen if some of that stuff we didn't evolve to pick out under particular conditions, rare but particular conditions, could sort of interfere with the signals we do pick up? Have an interference. No, our sensors were not made to pick them up because they don't have they don't have a bearing on our ability to survive. We do equally well with or without them, so we don't pick them out. But they create an interference, some intrusion into the channels that are supposed to pick up what is relevant to us. How would we experience that? We would experience that as something absurd, something that doesn't add up, because interference doesn't add up, right? I'm a computer engineer. I'm very familiar with the interference. If you're measuring the signals in certain bus lines, and then there is an oscillation that cannot be attributed to the transitions of those lines, you're picking up interference because it's illogical. It doesn't belong there. Now, it's not what you would expect to see by measuring that line. Same thing with these dynamics of the real world that may interfere with our ability to sense what we want to sense. If they interfere, we will see them as absurd versions of what we expect to see. But it's not what they will be. They are what they are, and they are incommensurable with our categories, because our categories have evolved to account for the contents of perception, not what interferes by some odd reason with our perception. So we don't have categories for these other things that are out there. So when they interfere, say, with a part of our existing categories that is supposed to discern spaceships or people, even if that thing that is interfering is not at all a spaceship, it's not at all a person, it's nothing you could put in a box because we don't have the boxes for it, but it would interfere with the channels with which we pick out people and spaceships. It would look to us as a distorted, ridiculous, a preposterous half spaceship or a preposterous person like something ridiculous and illogical, because that's the nature of interference. It doesn't mean that it is that weirdness. It's following its own logic. It's just not our logic. It's not our Aristotelian logic. It's not following our categories, because our categories evolved to account for what we evolved to perceive, not this non-salient stuff that plays tricks and interferes with our perception. So, of course, this stuff looks absurd. It doesn't follow our logic, doesn't follow our categories, and yet it's pretty true.
So, I mean, I think you're alluding there to sort of some of the experiences like the dwarfs and other sort of beings people see in DMT trips, but also what have been called high strangeness, UAP or UFO experiences.
I'm alluding to high strangeness, not DMT, because DMT is a perceptual experience. It's an endogenous experience. It's something.
All right. Okay. Fair enough. Sort of a skeptic or a critic would say, well, that's all due to misperceptions or hallucination. Do you think there would be a way to distinguish genuine interference from something that's just subjective?
There should be theoretically, but I think in practice it's very difficult. The human mind loves to deceive itself, because the human mind seeks comfort, not truth. Mm-hmm. These legions of Westerners doing Eastern spirituality, they are not doing it because they want to find out what is true. They are doing it because they want to stop suffering. They want to be more comfortable. The mind always wants to be more comfortable, so it will deceive itself every opportunity it gets if it senses that here is an opportunity to find comfort. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to distinguish this natural tendency towards self-deception from objective interference with our cognitive channels that is done by an agency that is not ours. It's an external agency, part of our cognitive neighborhood, and not our own wish-fulfilling self-deception narratives. I'm not a psychologist. I wouldn't know how to distinguish. I think both things do exist, but I do think operationally it's extraordinarily difficult to distinguish between them. Perhaps you could try to do that through the way science operates, through statistics and multiple subjective reports independently collected.
Finally, you've got a new book out, haven't you? Could you tell us a little bit about that, just to finish?
Okay. So I've been writing publicly and speaking publicly about metaphysics now for 15 years. So I'm a proponent of analytic idealism, which is this notion that there is a real world out there, but it's mental, and physicality is just what it looks like unobserved from across a dissociative boundary, and life is what dissociation looks like. So I've been talking and writing about this for 15 years now, and over those years, you learn a lot about how to reach people where they are. Because in the beginning, you're speaking out of your own perspective, because that's all you have. But as you interact with thousands of people over the years, you understand that they are coming at it from a perspective different from yours. Their references are different. Their context is different. So you learn how to reach them where they are. So I wrote this book now called Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. It's short, no jargon, concise, to the point. It doesn't even have citations and bibliography. I put them in the running text. But unlike my other books, which are exhaustively documented, this one is meant to be read in one sitting, one Saturday, one Sunday. And it's a summary of analytic idealism that embodies what I learned over the years about how to meet people where they are, how to directly address the questions they will have before they even have them, to offer replies to the criticisms I know they will have before they think it through completely, because I have seen it for 15 years. So that's the book. It's coming out at the end of October 2024.
Oh, brilliant. So it would actually be a good place for anyone curious about your work to take this further.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's the place for everyone to come in contact with my work. It's that short, sweet book.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, well, Bernardo, it's been a really fascinating chat. So I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'm sure you've left plenty of food of thought. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
What Lies Beyond with Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.